Hey, my real estate students. Okay, so I was going through some old hard drives and I found some really solid material on police power, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. Now, these are definitely on your examination, so I want you to check out these segments. Now, they're a little bit of an archive, so it's a blast from the past, so the old beard is going to be a little bit different, but the information is solid and it's going to help you get through this examination. So good luck with your studies, good luck on your exams, and I hope you enjoy this material on the government powers.
In this next segment, we're going to be talking about the policing power components and comprehensive planning. Now, with policing power, generally speaking, we're not just talking about, the arresting authority of police. We're also talking about the inspectional services, building department. We're talking about health department. We're talking about all of these different components, zoning and planning commissions. All of these components make up our policing power. Now, how does it work? Well, the big government, the federal government, will enable the state governments to be able to police its citizens, and the state governments allow their local governments to be able to do the same thing. And we call this enabling acts. So big government enables little government. Now, the comprehensive plan specifically is a big picture plan, and one of the components you want to know, depending on where you guys are going to be taking this examination, is we want to know that the comprehensive plan can sometimes be referred to as the master plan. Now, who puts together the master plan or the comp plan? Basically a planning commission. It could be a planning commission appointed by a city council, and the planning commission does the planning, and then the city council approves the planning. So that's typically how the flow goes. For example, in the city of Boston, it's the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So we have the BRA, and those guys are the planning commissions. So what happens with planning, or master planning, is we're looking for this long term plan. It's this big picture plan, and it's not a regulatory document as far as legislation. It doesn't require certain things, but it's some things that we would like to see happen over a span of time. Now, what we tend to look to with comprehensive planning is things like land use, how we expect to utilize certain sectors of the area in which we're planning. So it could be for commercial purposes, it could be for residential purposes, etc. The other things that we're doing here is we're also determining if we need more housing of present and anticipated residents. And we're looking at declining neighborhoods and revitalization of those declining neighborhoods. And all of these other components go into the land planning and housing needs for our communities. We're also looking at utilities and schools and parks and libraries and all of these different components and their development around us. Storm water management and sewer management and waste management and all these other components. And then one of the main components these days with comprehensive planning happens to be environmental considerations. So all of these different components go into it, and we utilize local institutional planning and city planning and county planning, and all of these plans kind of come together and they make up this world of master planning. Now, what the master plan is the big picture, and how do we achieve the master plan? In our next topic, we're going to be talking about a concept called zoning. One of the regulatory tools that we have in our tool bag when it comes to comprehensive planning is zoning. So zoning is a tool that helps us achieve the master plan. And typically what we do is it helps us break up various areas in the overall big picture. So we could designate residential districts, and we can also designate areas for commercial purposes, and we can designate all of these different land uses so they're not really conflicting with one another. So zoning is this tool. Now, there are no nationwide or statewide zoning ordinances. So I want you guys to know that zoning is all local. It's completely local, and the local government determines zoning. So every little town and community will have different zoning and allowances. Some towns might have a lot of commercial influence, and some towns might not want that much commercial influence, more residential. Now, one of the points of zoning is to help achieve harmony in our surroundings. And if we can achieve this harmonious balance, then we can sustain values. So conforming to each other is what properties tend to want to do. And maximum value many times can be realized if properties sit in harmony with their surroundings. So if you're talking an entire residential area, then all of the properties are residential in nature, and they tend to be valued, they sustain their value if they are valued in those particular types of scenarios. So that's what we're looking for with comprehensive planning. Now, zoning affects such things as setback requirements. Setback requirements are the minimum distance to or away from one structure that another structure can be built. So, for example, the setback requirements for putting up a fence from a structure on your property, a fence line, might be, I'm giving you an example, 15, 20 feet away from the fence line. You could maybe put only a shed in your backyard if it's 15 feet from one fence and 20 feet from another. So setback requirements will define what you can and you cannot do as far as placing physical structures on your property or coming close to other particular properties or your neighbors. So those are called setback requirements, and that's a pretty popular one on examinations. When we come back, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about other components of zoning and take a look at an example and understand how zoning works overall. We're talking about zoning, and one of the zoning components that sometimes will come up is a vocab phrase. This is a popular one on most examinations across the country, and it's known as snob zoning. So snob zoning, in essence, is where the local area determines zoning to kind of lock certain components out. And snob zoning, for example, classically could be that we won't allow any commercial influence in a residential area. So that could be a forbidden zone, which means that if anybody wants to open up some sort of commercial influence, a store, a shop, a restaurant, in an area that's zoned forbidden, then you might not be able to put that in there. So that could be argued that that's a version of snob zoning. It's prohibiting certain things. Now, in some areas, like beach communities, for example, you see this often, they tend to make property structures similar, or they don't allow certain things, or you can't subdivide your property even if you can build more structure because of the snob zoning laws. So snob zoning is one of those things, but we have to be careful with snob zoning because it could lead to discrimination. It could lock out certain protected classes of people from entering into an area. So snob zoning is a popular one that tends to show up on examinations. Look out for it, you might see it. So what we're going to look at here in this diagram is we're going to talk about a couple of vocab phrases that tend to come up on the examination. We're going to use a visual aid here to kind of explain it. In this diagram, we've got four properties, property A, B, C, and D. There's a fence separating all of the properties, and property A, property B, and property C happen to have swimming pools in their backyards. And property D, note, does not. Now, it's not necessarily fair that D doesn't have it. Maybe D didn't put the pool in, or that parcel happened to not have it. Everybody else put their pools in around the same time, and D didn't do it. But D would like to put in a swimming pool now, but they're no longer allowed to because let's say the zoning changed in the area and no longer or forbids any kind of a structure to be anywhere near a fence line within a certain feet. So the setback requirements changed. And now the minimum distance from one structure to another structure near a fence needs to be a fair amount of space away. Well, all of the other properties, A, B, and C, have the pools put in, and they predate that changing to the zoning. You see, zoning isn't static. It's always changing as we change. And as we change, we tend to change the way that we look or our perspective of zoning. And what we can always do is we can move forward, but sometimes it's hard to go backwards and to say, hey, listen, now everybody's out of compliance with zoning. So what we do instead is we allow those old uses to continue, and that's called grandfathering. So property A, property B, and property C in this example are grandfathered in, and they can continue the use of the swimming pools, so long as there's nothing unsafe about the construction. Now, property D, if they want to change to the zoning, they're going to have to apply through a zoning hearing board or a board of appeals. We call them ZBAs. They are going to have to apply for what we call a variance. So a variance is an exception to the zoning rules. And what the variance in essence is doing is it's saying, hey, listen, I've been denied or I've been injured because I'm denied the right to use my property like my other neighbors are, and I feel that granting me this variance would allow me to utilize my property in a way that's similar conforming to the other property owners. So if the ZBA approves the zoning application, then they can approve the variance use, and if the variance is now approved then the owner D can get a building permit to be able to construct the pool and now have a swimming pool in their backyard. Now let's say, also unrelated, But if property A wants to put in a house of worship or a daycare center and property C wants to do the same thing in our diagram, then what they would apply for is another vocab phrase that we're going to want to know, and it's called a special use permit or a conditional use permit. You might have seen somewhere in the neighborhoods that you come from that maybe there's a home-based business or let's say a doctor's office connected to the back or the one part of a single-family house. And those uses are preconditioned or allowed subject to applying for a permit, which is called a conditional use permit. So, a couple of more of the vocab phrases that you want to be familiar with. Setback requirements, zoning, zoning hearing boards, variances, conditional or special use permits, and non-conforming use and grandfathering. All very popular in the policing section for your examinations. Now, when we come back, we're going to look at other policing powers, and we're also going to continue and wrap up our discussion on police and go to the other government powers coming up soon. Our next government power that we have to deal with as far as interest in real property is a very simple one, but it's a classic one for examinations. It's known as eminent domain. And what eminent domain is eminent domain is the right of government. It's the constitutional right of government to basically take private citizens' land for necessary public use. Now, this is in all of the constitutions across every state and in the federal constitution. So it's the takings ability for we the people. We might feel that taking someone's land to utilize it for a way somewhat different than what they're using it for, could be expanding a roadway, for example, that's the classic one, to take that land and to expand the roadway so we can all benefit from that improvement. That's known as eminent domain. And I want you to remember that it's the right of government. Now, the process through which government takes the land is known as condemnation. So condemnation is your next vocab phrase. And condemnation is the process through which government takes the property for the right of eminent domain. Now, before they can take our property, what has to happen is they have to offer us compensation. So another vocab phrase that goes hand in hand with eminent domain and condemnation happens to be compensation. So for this purpose, I want you guys to remember the three vocab phrases: eminent domain, condemnation, and compensation. Now, one component that they tend to test you on here, there's a few things that you want to know. Number one, eminent domain is a type of involuntary alienation. Remember, the word alienation means to transfer. So an involuntary transfer of my property, I didn't want to lose my property, but I'm forced to because of eminent domain. So there it's an involuntary alienation. Now, beyond the involuntary alienation component that you want to know for your exam, you also want to know that we, the people, cannot take government land through eminent domain. So the door only swings one way. It's government taking private citizens' land, not private citizen taking government land through eminent domain. So taxation, for the purposes of the examination, is one of your government powers. If you look at the chart, there's police power, eminent domain, which we just talked about, taxation, and escheat. Now, the taxation elements are, there's several vocab phrases, and we need to kind of focus on a couple of things. We can get into a very long-winded discussion about taxation because it can go on and on and on and on. But as far as taxation is concerned, what you need to know for your exam purposes, well, number one, taxation is a government power. Number two, you guys want to know, we have two components when it comes to taxes. We have general real estate taxes, which is an ad valorem tax. An ad valorem tax is Latin for according to value. So that's a vocab phrase you definitely want to know on your examination. And then the other component to taxation is something called special assessment taxes. Special assessment taxes are for specific construction projects or improvements in a certain area. So for example, let's say we're improving sidewalks in one area in front of all these shops, and let's say we're doing that and putting in new lights. Well, the other community may not have to pay the tax for that. Maybe in that improvement district, only the specific businesses that are profiting or benefiting from those improvements have to pay a special assessment. Very similar to a special assessment on a condo association if we have to replace the roof or something like that. Now let's talk a little bit more about general real estate taxes. So number one, you want to know that it's an ad valorem tax. So ad valorem taxes are according to value and are specific taxes for that property. They are specific taxes. So we want to know that ad valorem taxes affect only that parcel of property. Now the property owes the tax, and typically the owner of the property will pay the tax. But it's not the person that owes the tax, It's the property. Now, real estate is a favored source to be taxed, and the reason why is it cannot be hidden very easily, and it can be valued, generally speaking, pretty easily as well. So we have all of these mass appraisal techniques, and we use very, very familiar techniques and familiar ground when it comes to making these valuation determinations for what properties are. And we take them and we lay them out across a jurisdiction, and we come up with a tax that each property needs to pay. And when we do that, now the non-payment of these taxes could lead to an interest that the government does obtain on our property, and they ultimately could sell our properties through the tax sale process, which we'll talk about during a later segment. But what I want you to know for right now is that ad valorem taxes are specific taxes, and they have to be paid. They're involuntary liens that are automatically created on property, and they are according to value. So let's talk about what happens when we don't pay our real estate taxes. Now, the first thing you guys want to know is the non-payment of my real estate taxes would allow the government an interest in our property. Now, what do they obtain? Not paying our real estate taxes allows the government to place a lien on our property. Now, this is an important type of lien. This is known as, in many jurisdictions, a super lien. A super lien is a type of lien that takes priority over all other types of liens. So when this particular lien occurs, then it takes precedence over every other type of situation or any other type of lien that's pre-existing on the property. The government, or we the people, get paid back first. So because we get paid back first, everybody else has to stand in line. So you want to know that the government or tax has the right of super lien. Now, this is the big reason that mortgage companies go ahead and pay the real estate tax portion for the consumer. So when you borrow money traditionally or typically from most banks, then they are going to require that they collect impounds or escrows for the taxes and the insurance. Now, by the insurance, we're talking property hazard insurance. So in case that property burns to the ground, the bank wants to make sure that they're protected. And really, at the end of the day, all federally related transactions have to have some kind of insurance. But for our discussion, we're talking about the taxation. So the taxes are collected by the bank, and the bank collects 1/12 every month from the mortgage payment and disperses the taxes according to how they need to be paid. In many jurisdictions, that happens to be every quarter. In some jurisdictions, that could be every half year. So the taxes are paid by the bank to make sure that they don't lose priority over the government when it comes to a tax lien. So principal, interest, taxes, and insurance are the four parts to a mortgage payment. And that's another one that's definitely on your examination. And when you guys take this thing, you want to know what PITI stands for. So once again, it's principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And for our discussion here, the T for taxes applies for ad valorem taxes. The final government power that we have to learn is something called escheat. So we've just gone through police power, we've gone through eminent domain, and we've gone through taxation. Now we need to go ahead and talk about escheat. And this one's really simple. You just need to know the basic framework of it. So escheat is the right of government when a party dies without a will, and that phrase is known as intestate. So when somebody dies without a will, they die intestate. If they die with a will, then they died testate. So if you were to pass intestate and you had no heirs to your estate, then the government has the right of escheat. And the word escheat means to revert back to. So in essence, what happens is our property, real and personal, if we have no one to give it to and we have no will and no heirs, it will revert back to the government. The government will take it, sell the assets, pay off any creditors, and absorb the profits. So escheat is a type of involuntary alienation. You want to know that. And you want to know intestate. When somebody passes intestate with no heirs, the government has the right of escheat. And that wraps up the police, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat component. That covers all of the government powers. And when we come back, we're going to look at the other side of this chart now and start to talk about all of the other items. For example, we're going to be covering things like freehold estates, leasehold estates, and encumbrances.